Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Hoimontik Gogoi, and I am a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. It's a matter of great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to all to another edition of the ICS Wednesday seminar titled The Politics of Pacifism, the Yoshida Doctrine in Post War Japan. After World War II, Japan transitioned from a devastated and defeated country to an advanced nation. This remarkable rise can be attributed to a combination of domestic and international developments, with the institutionalization of pacifism as a state policy playing a significant role, imposed by the victorious Americans as a binding constitutional provision. Pacifism was adeptly employed by Japan to channel its efforts towards economic reconstruction while relying on the United States for security. This policy, however, came with its own set of challenges. The seminar, in the context of aforementioned information, will examine the evolution of pacifism as a policy from 1947 to 1991, situating it within the broader context of the US Japan alliance. The speaker for today's seminar is Mr. Akshat Maini, who is a research assistant at the Institute of Chinese Studies. He is pursuing his doctorate in Japanese studies from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He holds a master's degree in East Asian Studies with a specialization on Japanese studies from the University of Delhi. His research area focuses on Japanese domestic politics, security, and foreign policy in the post war era, as well as the evolving dynamics between various regional players, particularly Japan and Taiwan. The chair for today's seminar is Professor Shravani Roy Chaudhary from Center for East Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She also is an adjunct fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. Her research area focuses on India Japan relations within the power dynamics of the Indo Pacific region and economic diplomacy between Japan and India. Her latest publication includes edited volumes titled Japan SARC Partnership, A Way Ahead, and India Japan Relations at 70, Building Beyond Bilateral. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants shall be muted during the seminar. Questions may be posted in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option during the interactive session. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself. Thank you. Now I hand over to the chair. Over to you, Professor Chaudhary. Thank you.
Thank you, Gogoi, and thank you for the warm introduction. Gogoi was also giving us a brief about the subject of discussion today, the politics of pacifism, the Yoshida Doctrine, post-war Japan. People who follow Japan would know that the Yoshida Doctrine has been almost a fulcrum on which the economic development program of Japan was crafted, and it led to Japan's supremacy in economic terms. However, the pacifism per se, which was basically thrusted upon Japan by the constitution crafted during the occupation period, did have repercussion across the time of economic development and since then. And as the world changed from being within the Cold War fulcrum to a multipolar system, the pacifism is continuing to, have various dimensions added to it because of way Japan and the world is seeing Japan's position within the international order. Today, I'm very happy that Akshat from Japanese Studies, JNU, is going to put forward his thoughts about how he has looked at the politics of pacifism. Akshat, you know the drill. You have the floor and you can go ahead and do it. People who are interested in posing questions can start using the chat box as and when they feel. Otherwise, you can wait for the end of the his presentation. Over to you, Akshat. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I wish to express my gratitude to Professor Alpacharya and Team ICS for this opportunity, and to Professor Roy Chaudhary for chairing the seminar. I will be speaking on the politics of pacifism, the Yoshida Doctrine in post-war Japan. And shortly, I will just share my screen. I hope my screen is visible, ma'am. Right. As I've just said, the topic will be the politics of pacifism, and my presentation will be structured in the following manner. I will start with a brief introduction of what pacifism actually is, because any discussion on pacifism, whether in the Japanese context or any other context, it is necessary to begin with a few existing theorizations of the concept. Followed by that, I will look into the origins of pacifism in post-war Japan, the pattern of development across four periods, sub-periods that I've taken up. The first will be under Yoshida Shigeru, followed by Kishi Nobusuke, Sato Eisaku, and then Nakasune Yasuhiro. Followed by this, I will be arguing that pacifism as policy essentially reached a breaking point by 1991. Jenny Teichmann has theorized that pacifism can be viewed from multiple standpoints and is essentially a cluster of theories and not a singular theoretical notion. Within this, different actors respond differently with varying degrees of opposition or acceptance of coercion and, by extension, violence, and this directly influences how pacifism is defined. Douglas Lackey is also of the view that pacifism cannot be theorized as a singular theoretical notion. However, he points out that Teichmann's theorizations remain quite ambivalent, especially with regard to the sub-concept of self-defense. There is another scholar, Andrew Alexandra, who draws from scholars like Teichmann and Lackey and notes that while pacifism today has a variety of senses, it originally and historically emerged as a name for opposition to war as a means to the resolution of conflict between states. Now, this also reveals a major problem with defining pacifism as a concept. It could easily have a multitude of meanings and definitions molded to suit specific or particular requirements. Alexandra's broad historical and rather ambiguous definition, when read in tandem with the pacifist clause enshrined in Article 9 of the post-war Japanese Constitution, presents a sense of convergence. Nonetheless, there is a lingering ambiguity in the said clause, thus leaving, if only barely, some space for interpretation and maneuverability. It is in this space that divergences with respect to theoretical pacifism start to become apparent in post-war Japan. Now, to contextualize pacifism within the post-war order. Now, following World War II, two nations, namely West Germany and Japan, enshrined pacifism as the central feature in their respective developmental paths. Both nations were also key players in the US-led alliance against communism in Europe and Asia, respectively. At the same time, there are differences that exist between Germany and Japan with regard to how they were located in the overall Cold War context. The Cold War battle lines cut straight through the heart of Germany, with American policy directed in full force towards the defense of Europe against Soviet communist influence. These battle lines, however, were not as clear in the case of Japan. The island nation instead became a hub for American operations against communism in Asia, as in the case of the Korean War in the early 1950s. Now, these differences also existed in the manner in which Germany and Japan rearmed in the post-war era. Given that the Cold War battle lines were apparent, emergent, and well-defined in Europe, the German Bundeswehr was organized and armed accordingly as a conventional military. The self-defense forces in Japan, or the Jieitai, on the other hand, stood in stark contrast in that it was, quote-unquote, a de facto military technically deemed a police force to avoid conflict with Article 9. Another very important way to look at the GSI is that it was formed to fill the country's military vacuum by providing for national defense capabilities as also to serve as a lightly armed national police force. So there is a lingering ambiguity between the overall role and operational scope of the GFI. Is it meant for internal security or is it meant for external security? Uh, Now, by implication, the broader role of the GFI was constrained to internal security unless there emerged an external military threat to the Japanese home islands. Such a threat, however, would have been deterred by the American defensive umbrella, and so the chances of GFI playing anything more than a supporting role to the American forces was negligible. This allowed Japan to maneuver in a comparatively different manner, as shall be discussed. Now, let's move on to the origins of pacifism in post-war Japan. Western scholars such as Peter Brock and Martin Seidel have sought to locate the roots of pacifism and peace movements within the realm of religion, especially in Christianity. They have also emphasized on World War I, given its massive scale and the concomitant destruction as a major turning point for the relevance of pacifist thought in the West. Here we see that a foundation of pacifist thought precedes the general acceptance of the same in the West. Now, Martin Seidel also goes a step further and creates a categorization of pacifism, which is a complete repudiation of war, and pacifism, which focuses on regulated violence within the larger ambit of preventing. Now, these ideas and categorizations work well in a Western setting. However, they do not hold much water in the case of Japan. Another scholar, Mari Yamamoto, has also argued in the same vein and has stated that such ideas developed from extant Western traditions, socio-religious traditions. However, in Japan, there are no consistently dominant nor unified strands of pacifist thought. No such extant tradition preceded the acceptance of pacifism as a concept in Japan. It was, here I come in, instead the experiences of the Japanese people during the Second World War that generated the groundwork for the acceptance of pacifism, the general acceptance of pacifism. Now, when Article 9 of the Pacifist Clause was added to the 1947 Constitution by the Americans, it took away something integral to the sovereignty of any nation state, the ability to choose whether to wage war or maintain peace, to be knowingly belligerent or willfully pacifist. Now, let's move on to how I argue pacifism as an enforced policy rather than an accepted policy. General Douglas MacArthur was appointed as the Supreme Commander Allied Powers with the mandate of demilitarization, democratization, and political decentralization of Japan. Apparently, these measures were to prevent the rise of militarism in Japan again and to guide the nation towards peace and prosperity. However, it is also pertinent to note that a pacified Japan was a necessity for the US and its interests in the region, especially in light of the communist threat emanating from the Soviet Union and the uncertainty with regard to the situation in China. Now, MacArthur's mandate also necessitated the drafting and promulgation of a new constitution, as the existing Meiji constitution was seen as a beacon of imperialism and militarism. Committees were formed, and at least for the sake of appearances, the SCAP considered it important to ensure that the Japanese were working closely with its office. This further legitimized the role and long-term objectives of the occupation forces and also provided a sense of legitimacy to the Japanese political class, which would carry forward the democratic and peace-loving ideals that formed the core of the SCAP's policies after the inevitable end of the occupation eras. The resultant Matsumoto draft, drafted by Matsumoto Joji, did not pass muster at the SCAP's office. MacArthur's directions were clear. The inclusion of a war-announcing article, the Pacifist Clause, was non-negotiable. The final constitution, which came into effect on 3 May 1947, was drafted by MacArthur's staff with the Pacifist Clause enshrined in Article 9. It is important to note that MacArthur's staff did not consider it necessary to run this draft by the Japanese political class of that time. Now, this is also important in the context of American interests in Japan. John Foster Dulles, former Secretary of State of the United States, created a concept called hub and spokes, and Japan was one of the very first spokes that came out of this. What essentially this entails is that America acts as a hub and is connected through bilateral alliances with various states in the Asia-Pacific region. And with this, they maintain the rules-based order in the broader Asia-Pacific region. So Japan was also arguably one of the most important spokes, and it allowed America a passage across the Pacific onward to Asia to project power and maintain the order that had been envisaged by the Americans and the Allies. At the same time, it was also necessary for containing the Soviet and Chinese threat, which impinged on communism across Asia. Now, here is, of course, one piece of an argument which I found very interesting. And moving forward, the post-war era, with rising tensions between the Soviets and the Americans, in addition to the threat from communist China and the potential spread of communism in Asia looming in the background, Japan essentially became a foothold across the Pacific for the US to project power, as I just mentioned. That Japan could also not possess or maintain a military of consequence for its own defense due to the pacifist clause, and therefore had to depend upon the US for security, also served to legitimize a continued US military presence on Japanese soil. This allowed the Americans to remain in close proximity to the Asian mainland with a sizable force ready to be deployed anywhere in Asia whenever required, as in the case of the Korean War. American interests had thus effectively mandated not only the inclusion of the pacifist clause, but also severe constitutional limits with regard to its amendment in the future. Consequently, pacifism developed much less organically and more in an enforced fashion in Japan, and this is keeping in mind American interests. Now, here we have a photograph of General MacArthur landing in Tokyo, and another photograph of General MacArthur with the Showa Emperor. Now, what is the pattern of development? I have employed the methodological tradition used by Professor Iokibe Kaoru in his text, where he essentially breaks the post-war era into a series of sub-eras according to the tenures of a few prime ministers in the beginning, which ultimately form integral components of a whole, which is the post-war era of Japan. Now, the compartmentalization, I've taken it a bit further in my presentation, and it is as follows. I cover Yoshida Shigeru, Ishinobusuke, Sato Eisaku, and Nakasume Yasuhiro. Now, carving the path and Yoshida Shigeru's tenure. Now, in pre-war Japan, Yoshida Shigeru had been an active bureaucrat and had very decisively opposed war with the Americans, drawing the ire of the pre-war governmental setup. And in the post-war era, he was considered a very likely candidate to become the prime minister of a reformed Japan. So he, of course, had his first tenure between 1946 and 47, and then his longest tenure between 1948 and 54. Yoshida, in his own words, chose the path of cooperation and acceptance of the fact that Japan was a defeated nation. And within his cabinet, although a conservative cabinet, there was a very strong consensus on retaining American bases after the end of the occupation. Now, this is where the conceptualization of what is known as the Yoshida Doctrine takes place. In essence, the Yoshida Doctrine is a framework through which the national energies of Japan are directed towards reconstruction and rebuilding, while all security needs are outsourced to the Americans. Now, there are various scholars who have discussed this, and I will come to that in a bit. Now, although American pressure in the early years of the 1950s pushed Japan to increase the size of the Jieitai, the expansion of the self-defense forces into a conventional military and changes in its operational scope was staunchly opposed by Yoshida, who cited Article 9 as a constraint. Now, Sun Ki-chai ascribes three primary reasons for Yoshida's apprehensions regarding this. These apprehensions ranged from endangering Japan's post-war economic recovery to his quote-unquote strong aversion to the imperial military establishment and quote-unquote his desire to minimize worries on the part of neighboring countries. Of greater focus, of course, is the first reason, which is instrumental in institutionalizing the Yoshida Doctrine. Now, various scholars have, of course, analyzed the same through a multitude of approaches. While Sun Ki-chai has assessed the defense policy aspects of the Yoshida Doctrine, Togo Kazuhiko and Kevin Cooney have reviewed its role within Japanese foreign policy. Sugita Yoneyuki has asserted that the so-called Yoshida Doctrine would not have been able to stand its own had there not been tacit acknowledgement of the Japanese aims from the Americans. And lastly, Hoshiro Hiroyuki has critiqued Yoshida Doctrine as a flawed policy. Now, we all talk about the Yoshida Doctrine as a very common term, but where does this emanate from? It's not a term which was devised by Yoshida himself. This was actually brought out by a scholar later named Masashi. Just one second. Masashi Nishimura, who essentially stated in 1978 that the trajectory of Japanese outreach towards the Americans and the general policy that they follow is essentially based on pacifism, and this derives from Yoshida's initial efforts, and therefore the Yoshida Doctrine. Now, despite the issues that the Yoshida Doctrine essentially accumulated over the years, successive leaders found it very difficult to move away from it. And this is where we look at the development and the benefits of this doctrine. Now, as mentioned, Yoshida's approach was of acceptance and cooperation. And his idea was that he would try to influence the office of the SCAP wherever possible, and wherever not possible, he would just take it in his stride and see to it that if it is possible, we will either use it to our advantage or we will try and apply it later. Now, as mentioned, of course, the American pressure to expand the GSI was staunchly opposed by Yoshida. So, what are the benefits of practicing this doctrine? Number one, the American security umbrella. Number two, minimal expenditure on security. The primary focus, like I mentioned, was on rebuilding Japan and reconstructing the economy. And lastly, the pacified Japan allowed access to American and allied markets, which was essential for the Japanese economic miracle that occurred in the 60s and 70s. At the same time, it is important to mention the costs. Now, Marius Jansen makes a very good argument on this, where he says that the primary cost of the Yoshida Doctrine was, quote unquote, virtually unrestricted use of Japanese territory by the United States and the resultant extraterritoriality. There were also questions that were raised on both the domestic and international fronts about Japanese sovereignty. Now we move on to the next sub-era, which is Kishi Nobusuke, who, in my opinion, made an attempt in earnest. Now, Kishi was an active part of the pre-war setup and considered himself a spiritual successor of the former Choshu leaders who had led the Meiji Restoration. He was also a political detractor of Yoshida. Now, when he came to power in the late 50s, he was faced with a dilemma: either rearm and strengthen Japan and lose the benefits of the Yoshida Doctrine, or maintain the status quo and continue with weak capacity for national defense. So, what was Kishi's approach? Firstly, it is important to mention, as Nick Kapoor has also said, that Kishi wanted an amendment of the existing US-Japan Security Treaty, or the ANPO, and not a complete abrogation. So his idea was to essentially make Japan less subservient to the United States and thus also feed to his own nationalistic tendencies. It also aimed to address the challenges in the 1951 treaty, which led to changes in 1960 when the treaty was supposed to be renewed. And the primary goal that was achieved by Kishi was that he reduced the uncertainty with regard to the US defensive umbrella. Initially, the US was not obligated by treaty to come to Japan's aid. In fact, it was that their interests aligned, that Japanese and US interests aligned, that the Americans came to Japanese aid. However, in the event that American aims did not align with that of the Japanese, the Americans were not mandated to come to their aid. So this was the change that Kishi brought in. Now, the Americans were treaty bound to come to Japanese aid when required. Now, of course, Kishi's original aims of a stronger and less subservient Japan did not come to fruition. However, his attempts further entrenched the Yoshida Doctrine. This is, of course, Kishi Nobusuke in the pre-war era with former Prime Minister Tojo Hideki. And I found it necessary to mention about the ANPO protests which took place in 1960 as a result of Kishi's actions and the renegotiation and thereafter the renewal of the US-Japan Mutual Security Treaty. So now we move on to Kishi's younger brother, Sato Eisaku. Now, Sato Eisaku came to power at a time when the armed protests had completely devastated Tokyo, and also at a time when Tokyo had also hosted the Tokyo Olympics, 1964 Tokyo Olympics, which can be seen as a symbolic move, a symbolic entry of Japan into the League of Responsible Nations. Um, which, of course, I also argue is a result of Yoshida's entrenchment of pacifism as policy. Um, at the same time, at this time, because the armed protests had just ended, there was a renewed relevance of Japanese pacifism and therefore the Yoshida Doctrine amongst the general populace of Japan. Even so, there were general frictions in the US-Japan alliance, especially with regard to what Togo Kazuhiko calls unwilling involvement, as well as the entrapment dilemma. The unwilling involvement essentially entails that, given that now both Japan and US are treaty bound to come to each other's aids, Japan might get unwillingly entangled in American-led military ventures across Asia, which of course was going to happen in the later years of the 1960s in Vietnam. Now, this was also a time when there was a rise of nationalist tendencies in Japan. At the same time, Okinawa, an entire prefecture in the south of Japan, was under US administrative control. And despite public sentiments regarding the nuclear weapons, the Americans still maintained a sizable number of nuclear warheads there and also maintained extraterritoriality. This, of course, fed into the nationalist tendencies during this period and, of course, led to the public questioning whether Japan is actually a sovereign state or not. Now, Sato was, of course, in favor of continuing the Yoshida doctrine, unlike his elder brother Kishi, given his very close relations with Yoshida in the past. And at the same time, he aimed to gain a semblance of sovereignty for Japan. So, what was his approach? Number one, he took the very important case at hand of Okinawa and went headfirst into negotiations with the Americans with regard to the reversion of Okinawa and implied and very very decisively implied that Japan is a pacifist and responsible nation, and therefore we have all the necessary requirements to administratively control Okinawa and take it back into Japanese and bring it back under Japanese sovereignty. He also argued very staunchly against the maintenance of nuclear warheads on Okinawa, and of course, again stated Japan is a pacifist state. At the same time, he also brought in the three non-nuclear principles, which were quite popular in the late 1960s. Despite Okinawan demands of the local population, the government of the time under Sato very strongly stated that the US military presence will be retained despite the reversion of Okinawa to Japan. And this became an important factor into the entire negotiations, which led to the reversion of Okinawa. So what we see is that Sato used pacifism as policy and further entrenched the Yoshida doctrine and ensured its continuation and therefore the continued US presence for Japanese security. This is, of course, Sato. He had a very great relationship with then President Richard Nixon, which is an important fact that I felt like mentioning here. Now we move on to the one of the major detractors of the Yoshida doctrine, which is former Prime Minister Nakasone Yasuhiro, who came to power in the 80s. However, it is important to also note his previous tenure as the Director General of the Japanese Defense Agency, the precursor of the present Ministry of Defense in the 1970s. Now, Nakasone's primary concern was with Japan playing a greater security role, at least for starters, in its immediate environment, in the immediate neighborhood. Uh, his tenure as the Director General of the Japanese Defense Agency also coincided with the Guam Doctrine, which was announced by Richard Nixon in 1969, which in a sense essentially said that despite the the defensive umbrella, Asian nations are exhorted upon to do more for their own security and for the security of their neighborhood. Now, this, of course, revealed clear cracks in the Yoshida doctrine. If the Americans are now asking their allies, especially Japan, to do more for their own security, then Yoshida doctrine becomes untenable. And like it has been mentioned here, quote unquote, Nakasone had been frustrated with the Japanese citizens' aversion to acquire strong defense capabilities, an aversion that he viewed as stemming from Japan's post-war, post-1945 pacifism and post-1945 Yoshida doctrine. Now, there was, of course, domestic and international fears during this time in the 1980s when Nakasone was in power of Japanese rearmament. There were two primary debates that went on internationally. One was that under the Yoshida doctrine, Japan is essentially having a free ride and they are not doing much for their own security, less of all for the security of the neighborhood. And the other debate, in contrast to this, was that Japan might just go back to its pre-war so-called militarist stance. Nakasone faced this dilemma, therefore, and he ultimately considered that it was better to be faced with the charges of taking a free ride on the Americans' shoulders rather than the charges of becoming militarist again. And therefore, despite Nakasone's initial aspersions that he had cast on the Yoshida doctrine, he was more or less forced, more or less, he had no options but to continue with the Yoshida doctrine. And therefore, this doctrine gets further entrenched. Nakasone's approach was a little different. He fostered very deep relations with then President Ronald Reagan, and very famously, this was known as the Ron Yasu friendship, stemming from the fact that this was the first time a US president and a Japanese prime minister referred to each other by their first names. And like I mentioned, Nakasone's primary focus was on greater self-defense capabilities, enhancing the operational scope of the Jihadai. And but eventually, he had to relinquish all of these aims of a greater security role for Japan, and had no option but to continue with the Yoshida doctrine. This is, of course, Prime Minister Nakasone with Ronald Reagan. Now, pacifism as policy at breaking point. Uh, Throughout these decades, under Yoshida, under Kishi, under Sato, and then under Nakasone, pacifism as policy and by extension the Yoshida doctrine did not emerge unscathed. There were major challenges that Japan faced by 1991, and 1991, of course, being the culmination of the first Gulf War. And back in the 1950s, Japan served as a base of operations and was also able to fill the production gap for essential materials, including food and military material and so many other things. And this was a beneficial setup for Japan and therefore defined the need and the legitimizing quality of the Yoshida doctrine. During the 1960s in Vietnam, there were fears of unwilling involvement. Of course, Japan was committed to Article 9 and tried to avert involvement as much as possible and was able to barely, by the skin of its teeth, Japan was able to save itself from getting militarily involved by virtue of the 1960 revised Armed Treaty and use pacifism as its sole defensive feature. However, in the early 1990s, the US-led coalition against Saddam Hussein, the US made demands for a greater Japanese participation, which also stemmed from the Guam Doctrine introduced by Richard Nixon. Japan was here in a very major dilemma because despite all sorts of negotiations, the Americans were adamant. And recently declassified documents also state that in 1991, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces dispatched 6 minesweepers to the Persian Gulf, which was a step out of the ordinary for Japan, a step completely out of the Yoshida doctrine. And Japan was, of course, able to, again, save itself from greater involvement by what has come to be known as Japanese checkbook diplomacy. In another declassified document, which is a memorandum of conversation between then Prime Minister Kaifo Toshiki and Dan Quayle, the Japanese pledged $14 billion in 1991 to the American coalition against Saddam Hussein's Iraq. So Japan was still meagerly able to manage its way out. but it had severe repercussions on how the Yoshida Doctrine was understood and accepted domestically and how it was looked at internationally. Now, there came a need to envisage a policy beyond pacifism and therefore beyond the Yoshida Doctrine. And this brought with it, again, a new dilemma. Do we continue to invoke Article 9 and therefore face American abandonment? Or we pledge to play a greater security role, abandon the Yoshida Doctrine, and therefore face entrapment in American led endeavors and entrapment in greater security role, which the Japanese are unable to presently provide. This is, of course, famously known as the abandonment versus entrapment dilemma. Uh, the reason why I end my uh, analysis at 1991 is because the shock that came during this period to the Yoshida Doctrine and therefore to Japan granted impetus to new policy ventures. There were a number of domestic and domestic international developments. On the international front, of course, Japan was looked at as someone who was escaping responsibility, and merely checkbook diplomacy is not going to make the cut. And domestically, and this was also the time, there was a very famous Japanese politician by the name of Ozawa Ichiro, who came up with the concept of normal Japan, drawing from nationalist tendencies and various other domestic political developments, including the defeat of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, which had been in power since 1955. This came about in 1993, and the Socialist Party of Japan actually took foothold. Now, in the latter part of the 90s, the LDP, of course, came back into power, and up until the reign of the rule of Prime Minister Koizumi in the early 2000s, the LDP was still trying to figure out how do we move beyond this dilemma? How do we move beyond and envisage a policy beyond the Yoshida Doctrine? And we see this during the tenure of Prime Minister Koizumi, where he, of course, reorganized and renamed the Japanese Defense Agency as the Ministry of Defense, and under the peacekeeping operations umbrella of the United Nations, dispatched the JEDI to Iraq, which was a first, again, a first of this sort, a first reinterpretation of Article 9, that peacekeeping operations are possible under the pacifist clause. Followed by this, of course, we have Prime Minister Abe, who in his first tenure envisaged the construct which is today known as the Indo-Pacific. And of course, there is a period after Prime Minister Abe's tenure up until his second tenure where we see a bit of a lull in developments beyond the Yoshida Doctrine. However, in 2012, when Abe comes back to power, Abe 2.0 starts with the first national security strategy in 2013. And if we look at the national security strategies from 2013 up until 2022, we can see the evolution of how Japan has taken it upon itself to move beyond the Yoshida Doctrine. Have they been able to move beyond it is a difficult question to answer, because they still employ remnants of the same and try to while reinterpretations of Article 9 are always underway, they try to use economic aid, overseas economic aid, to mitigate the pressure, domestic and foreign pressure, to play a greater role. Now, this brings me to my conclusion. And Japan's post-war era, of course, is defined by three things: the inclusion of Article 9, the US-Japan alliance, and the Yoshida Doctrine. It is important to note, as I have argued, that pacifism is not an inherent concept to Japan and rather is an enforced ideal which was accepted by a war-weary population. Pacifism as policy and thereafter Yoshida Doctrine faced various challenges across the several decades that followed, and succeeding leaders, that is, of course, Kishi, Sato, Nakasone, and even Koizumi and Abe, they employed it either willingly or rather had no choice but to go ahead with it. Yoshida, of course, established the system. Kishi tried to alter it. Sato used it to Japan's greater advantage, and Nakasone tried to move beyond. At the same time, the argument that I make as to why pacifism's policy came to an effective end by 1991 is that the prevalent conditions outmoded any major change, and therefore these leaders had to maneuver around pacifism. And after 1991, they were left with no choice but to envisage a a more forward-thinking and a more well-rounded policy. And of course, the Yoshida Doctrine is extremely important as a precursor to policy decisions in the 21st century. The Yoshida Doctrine should also be seen as a major precursor to the current policy, which is of Sekkyoku Tekiheiwa Shogi, which is proactive pacifism, which came about under Abe 2.0. And this is, of course, where I will end my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Akshay. It was pleasant hearing how you developed the whole concept of Yoshida Doctrine being, the envelope being moved at each point of time to accommodate the new dynamics that was unraveled for Japan. A couple of questions already on the chat box, so I will go through them one by one, and Akshay, you can, contemplate and write. Rajkumar writes that can India reactivate the Russia, India, Japan trilateral in medium to long term? And can India help out both Russia and Japan to have some kind of understanding on Kuril Island issue, as India did in Sakhalin issue, even after Ukraine war and its sanctions, though it is really not relevant to the subject that you just dealt with, but that's a question you have. Would you like to answer it?
Certainly, ma'am.
Sure.
I am not qualified enough to speak about Japan-Russia ties in detail. However, I can, of course, make one comment, which is that India may be able to play a role as a mediator, but I see that as highly unlikely given that the Sakhalin and Kuril Islands issue has been going on since 1945. And before 2022, of course, before the Ukraine invasion, Japan and Russia were on at least moving towards a negotiating table to figure out a way to solve this issue. However, Japanese sanctions against Russia have completely outweighed any possibility, at least in the near future, for any such negotiations towards resolving dispute. And it is very difficult for me to situate India in this context. Of course, India has good relations with both Russia and Japan, but at the same time, the geopolitical setting does not afford me the relevant requirements for India to play that kind of a role there.
Okay. He's followed it up with one more question. I suppose you can see it in your chat box also. In medium to long term, can India really move out of Japan from American sphere of influence into Japan having some kind of strategic autonomy as compared to the current situation of Japan of nearly selling her strategic autonomy to USA, led West, as USA is playing her politics through Japan as she did with the recent economic sanctions on India by Japan?
Right. I will actually begin with a question. It's not whether India wants to or can. The question is, does Japan want it? At the end of the day, the Japanese aims align very symmetrically with US aims. There is, of course, one concept called Gaiyats, which is foreign pressure. And American pressure on Japan, as I've also looked at in my presentation, has brought Japan to very strong and heated debates in the national diet. And domestic and internationally, Japan has received a lot of criticism for blindly following the Americans. It is, however, important to mention that the Japanese do not do anything blindly. The Japanese are fairly, very, their political class is fairly aware of these matters. And I personally feel that Japan is quite comfortable with the current autonomy in terms of strategy that it has. And whether or not India wants to do that, I have no idea, but I can definitely say that Japan at this moment does not do
that. Thanks, Akshat. We go on to the next question by Purnima Nair. She says, can the emergence of groups like Tate no Kai and Sokupaku Botai in the 1960s under the leadership of Yukio Mishiyama, you must be aware of this, be seen as a reaction against this imposed pacifism?
Okay, thanks, Purnima. That it brings back memories of the time I used to read Mishima as a literature student, and so the essence is that we need to identify where does Mishima come from. Mishima came from a samurai background. He came from an era where what the West calls militarism and ultranationalism. I will reserve my comments on what I call that, but Mishima comes from that period. His ideals, his ways of thinking come from that environment, that very politically charged environment of the 1920s and 30s. So his formation of Tatenukai, which was of course an unarmed militia, which ultimately took over a self-defense forces base and where he committed seppuku or ritual suicide. It should be seen more in the light of Mishima's lament, Mishima's protest against a subservient Japan, the Japan moving away from its history, the Japan refusing to identify itself within a broader and emerging concept. That is where Mishima and Tatenukai, by extension, comes from. Uh, and I will not say that it is a protest against imposed pacifism. It is more a protest against Japanese receptivity, political receptivity to this enforced pacifism. Thank you.
Thanks, Akshat. You have one more from Tarunika. What is the public opinion regarding Article 9? How does Japan ruling party garner public support about the possibility of reforming Article 9?
Okay, thank you, Toroniko. A very interesting and important contemporary question. We have seen this, especially under Prime Minister Abe, the manner in which he tried to reinterpret instead of amend or alter Article 9, and a reinterpretation has essentially been pushed down through the national diet across the general populace. And the idea is that the current realities are not suitable to Japan hiding behind pacifism, or Japan not recognizing the realities of the threats faced by its surrounding nations. This, of course, I can say in the case of Taiwan, where Abe was very unequivocal when he said that Taiwan's emergency is Japan's emergency. So it is through such reinterpretations that leaders like Abe have tried to mold the public's opinion. But have they been successful? And to what extent have they been successful if so? I will say that they have been successful to a great extent in generating public consensus. However, it still falls way short of a point where the leaders can actually reinterpret and later amend, if possible, this particular article of the Japanese Constitution. Um, there are various groups, especially within Japanese universities, student groups, and a lot of other groups which which are active in Japan, which look at any such alteration, reinterpretation, or so and so forth as a as an abandonment of Japan's decade-long promise to pacifism and Japan's claims of being a pacifist power. So public opinion is quite divided, but at the same time, the public opinion on retaining Article 9, the public opinion on not reinterpreting it is a bit stronger than the opinion on reinterpreting. Thank you.
Um, there is, I think Imran is out here. I think Imran from Afghanistan. Is it possible for you to ask the question, because I do not understand? Explore the significance of Japanese constitutions, especially Article 9 renouncing war, in influencing and upholding the Yoshida doctrine. I suppose your entire presentation was in the lines of this, whatever he's written. So is there any specific question that Imran has to ask out here? Is it that you're wanting to know if Article 9 was not there, would it have been different? Or is it that, because you have Article 9, therefore you have Yoshida Doctrine? Well, no, reply from Imran on this. Okay. Well, Imran, I need to know what this okay means. Imran, you've been made a host. You can easily ask the question yourself. You can unmute yourself as well as switch on your video so that you can ask the question. Okay, Imran, while you are activating your thing, I think Ambassador has raised a hand. So go ahead and ask your question, sir. So you can go ahead and ask the question. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Akshat, excellent presentation, very clear, very informative. I wanted to ask you this, that has anyone quantified the value of the policy of pacifism in the following way, that for these, let's say, 60 years or so, 70 years, Japan has avoided a large amount of defense expenditure, right? Let's say it comes to 100 trillion yen. I'm just picking a number. Now, in that 100 trillion yen have been applied to domestic reconstruction and development, which has led to whatever. Using some formula, you can calculate the enhancement of GDP or welfare or whatever. So as against that, these other formulae that are being suggested by the opponents of the pacifism policy will have a similar impact on the other side of the balance sheet. I don't know the number, whatever it is. What I'm asking is, has something like this been worked out, which can put to the public a very concrete question in terms of stuff they can comprehend? In other words, the costs of reversing the policy, whatever they are, will be easily comprehended against whatever are the benefits that people say will accrue. Has such a thing been done or even attempted?
Thank you so much for your questions, and it is so good to see you again. Regarding the quantification of this problem, there is a very strong debate. Let me begin with this. With the Yoshida Doctrine from the post-war era, the Japanese have maintained less than 1% of their GDP as their overall expenditure on defense, or rather self-defense. Detractors of this policy have, of course, said that less than 1% is not enough. With less than 1%, we can barely do anything. There is absolutely no hope for increasing the operational scope, the capabilities, the value, in a sense, of the self-defense forces, and therefore Japanese security capabilities, if this particular self-imposed boundary is not transgressed. And whereas the supporters of this particular policy have said that it is because Japan has spent less than 1% of its GDP on defense, Japan has been able to focus all of the other budgetary allowances into sectors such as innovation, sectors such as education, and so on and so forth. And we do see this in the form of how Japanese innovation evolved between the 60s, 70s, and 80s. By the 80s, the Japanese were the world's foremost producers of automobiles. Every second car in the United States was Toyota or a Subaru or any of these varieties. And of course, the Americans reacted to this with the Plaza Accords in 1985. But coming back to the point, this debate has fluctuated between the pros and cons of moving beyond the 1% cap on uh, the defense budget. And the public, of course, is also equally divided, as is the national diet. The present Prime Minister, Kishida Fumio, has, of course, through a new economic policy, has said that in the years to come, we intend to move beyond this gap and build more of our defense capabilities. So these debates have existed since the 60s, if I'm not wrong, the 60s, when tendencies began to arise in Japan of their own identity as a sovereign nation, as a nationalist tendency began to rise. It has been there, and it has fluctuated between these two groups. And of course, there is another group which a scholar, I think John Mendel, it is in the 60s, he carried out a very interesting survey of how the Japanese population reacts to the Yoshida Doctrine, to pacifism as policy, to of course money being instead of defense being spent on economic recovery, and he finds three groups: one that has not made up its mind and therefore has no opinion, one that is absolutely fine either way, and one which is in fighting amongst itself of whether do we increase or do we decrease. So he has found this, and it has largely remained that attitudes are changing, public opinion is changing, and this, of course, stems from how the leaders are putting it forward. So it's a bit of a mishmash of opinions, which is also very typical of the Japanese political arena. So I think so I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. Thank you, Akshay.
Thank you, sir. I think it takes the Q&A to the next level now. The person who I was, Imran, is, I think, not out here anymore. There is one question that is addressed to me, but Rajkumar, this is Akshay's day. I'm not going to be the person who's going to answer the question. He, of course, asks whether India can get out of this trap that has been laid out by the Western world to overtake China. If you see it, it says that Japan having over 70,000 companies in China, and USA having over 80,000 companies invested in China against a very small number in India. Do you think India can, beat this to become, a stronger economy?
All right, ma'am. If I'm getting it right, it's to say that India as against China as an investment hub. Um, I will give a basic idea based on what I've of course studied. The idea is that you see the interactions, the economic interactions between Japan, China, and even Korea for that matter, because of a set of similarities that these states have. And similarities in business practices, similarities in a number of other things. And they're fairly open to a degree towards how each of the other states operates, because they pretty much understand how, or at least have a semblance of an understanding. Japan has, of course, in the last 2 decades, tried to bring in investments, but the manner in which the Indian business scene works is fairly different from the manner in which the Japanese business environment operates. And in the 80s, if I remember, and of course, then in the 90s, every second household had a Maruti Suzuki, which came as a derivative of the Indian Maruti group and the Suzuki group in Japan. And even then, it died out later on, and now Maruti is a subset of the Suzuki group. So why does this happen? Why why is India not able to take such a good precedent and move forward? I think the answer lies in the fact that there is a dissonance between how India and Japan approach economics and business. And unless that is addressed at a business to business and government to government level, it will be very difficult for greater Japanese investments beyond the current scale in India. So I think based on my understanding, that is what I can tell.
Thank you, Akshay. Is there any more questions for Akshay? Okay, we have one new message. Wait. Has Shinzo Abe, Rajkumar is very active. Has Shinzo Abe's sudden demise changed the strategic momentum in Japan, or will Japan follow the same path in future?
Right, ma'am, that is a very interesting question with a lot of answers, and I'll give my take on it. Abe Shinzo and Kishida Fumio come from different factions of the LDP, and the different factions also entail different views on how to envisage, implement, and take forward strategy and policy. Uh, it is important to note while Abe was far more inclined and far more overt in his gestures, especially towards defining concepts like Sekkyoku-teki Heibasho or proactive pacifism, Kishida is a little reserved on that front. Kishida has more in line with the old Yoshida school of thought of yore than he has with Abe's line of thinking, and this we see in Kishida's very strong overtures towards the Americans, getting involved in a situation which is not directly affecting Japan. I'm of course referring to Ukraine, building major ties with the American government and more or less bringing back some aspects of the Yoshida doctrine. And so, while I will not say that there is a very direct and exact continuum of policies, I will say that Abe's policies are so strong and so important and so integral that they find their place in the policies that Kishida is drafting and Kishida's overall policy, how they figure into Kishida's overall policy. But at the same time, Kishida is also bringing in a slightly distinct character to these policies and strategies. So again, there is no direct continuum, but there exists, at least in the manner of them these policies, Abe's policies, finding a place. Yes, there is a basic continuum.
Yes, Gogoi, what do you want me to do? Because all questions have been answered. Is anyone else willing to ask questions by raising hands? I have a couple of large number of people still at online in this platform. Okay, Gogoi, I think I hand over it to you because you can close the session then.
Thank you, Professor Chaudhary. Now I seek your permission to formally bring an end to today's session.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and thank you, Akshat, for a good presentation and answering your Q&A aptly. I wishing you all of you well and a very rich weekend coming ahead. Have a good time, and over to you to close. Over.
With this, we come to the end of today's seminar. We thank Mr. Maini and Professor Chaudhary for gracing today's seminar with their presence and for giving us their precious time. The video of today's discussion will be available on the ICS YouTube channel. We would like to invite you to the upcoming Wednesday seminar. Further information regarding the event can be found on the ICS website. You may also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you for joining us today, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, everybody. Akshat, I had read your paper so thoroughly, I didn't have any questions, frankly. Okay. Thanks a lot. Well done. Well done.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks, Shrabani.
Yep.
Thanks a lot.